Okay, so let's talk about food chains, food webs, and trophic levels in this introductory video. So let's go ahead and start with this ecosystem. Here we can see a number of plants and animals and fungus represented here. So let's go ahead and see how they are connected. Here we have some grass. And the deer is going to eat the grass because the deer is an herbivore, but then the deer will be hunted on as prey by the predator of a mountain lion. And here we have the mouse is going to eat some of the seeds from this plant or this bush, and then the mouse could be eaten by the snake, and then the snake could be eaten by the eagle. Or we have the grasshopper eat the leaves of this plant, and then the grasshopper is eaten by the small bird, which is eaten by the bigger bird, etc. So as we look at all the different populations living together in an ecosystem, here we can see that different species are dependent on each other for food and energy. So when we start to define these things, we can call this transfer of energy. We basically call this a food chain. So in a food chain, we are watching or seeing the flow of energy and matter from one organism to the next. So when we look at a food chain, the arrow is really showing us the direction, the energy, and sometimes it's more specific to matter, but here I'm talking about energy. So it shows the direction the energy is flowing. So when the plant does photosynthesis, because it's a producer and an autotroph, and it takes the solar energy from the sun and converts it into stored carbohydrates called glucose and saves it, well, now that's stored energy. And then the mouse, when it eats the seeds or when it eats the plant, now that energy that was stored in the plant is being passed to the mouse. And that's like when we talk about why do we eat? We get energy from our food, right? Like when we take in our food, that's how the energy is entering into us. So here, the energy is going from the plant to the mouse. And so, oops, can you see that? And then when the mouse is eaten by the badger, that energy that was stored in the mouse is now being transferred to the badger, as well as the matter as well, the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So energy stored in the mouse is passed to the badger. And then when the badger is eaten by the mountain lion, then the energy, any energy remaining is now passed from the badger to the mountain lion. Now, energy gets used up. Like when you go for a run or a walk or a bike ride, you're using up your energy. So energy does get lost at each step in the food web or food chain. So it's not infinite. You cannot have infinite steps in this food chain because the energy, the available energy, will eventually run out. Okay, so if we look back at our ecosystem here, we saw multiple food chains all represented within this community. So remember, a community is a group of or groups of different populations all living together and interacting. So here we can see how these organisms are dependent on other species for their survival. But what we also see is it's not just single food chains. Instead, more realistically, we have what's called a food web. And a food web shows the interacting of different food chains. For example, that mouse isn't going to be eaten by only snakes, right? Badgers might eat the mouse. Mountain lions or eagles might also eat the mouse. There's going to be multiple organisms that rely on mice for food. Okay, so when we look at this food chain, or now it's a food web, we can also divide it into different categories. So we have our autotrophs or our producers, and these are the bottom of the food chain or the food web. This is what the whole entire food web is based on, because it's producers that are going to take energy from the sun and convert it into a type of energy, a chemical energy that organisms can use. So it takes solar energy and converts it to chemical energy that now when the deer eats the plants, it can have energy. Okay, so above the producers, we have what's called consumers. So we have different kinds of consumers. We have herbivores, omnivores, carnivores, predators, prey, etc. But they all consume. These are our heterotrophs. So here we can divide our food web into autotrophs or producers, and then our consumers or our heterotrophs. Now, you may be wondering, what about our decomposers? Where do they fit into this? Well, decomposers are our mushrooms or our bacteria, like not just mushrooms, but fungus or bacteria. And in reality, they don't eat. They're not consumers, but they do recycle matter and the bodies of dead and decaying organisms. And so really that's how they get their energy. So if you were going to draw arrows, really the arrows from all the organisms would end up at the decomposers. Now, it's not to say, though, decomposers are not the top of the food chain or the top of the food web. They're not the top predators. They are just the kind of like the last step in taking any extra energy and matter and recycling it back into the earth. Well, they don't recycle the energy. They'll use the energy, but the matter will be recycled back into the earth. Now, we have some more vocabulary words to add to this. So here, as we divide our food web into different steps or levels. So here I've divided it into 4 sections, and we call these sections trophic levels. So trophic level represents each step or chain, I guess, each step or link in a food web or food chain. And they have special names. So the first one with our plants is called our primary producers. Then we're going to have our herbivores. Whatever eats those plants are called our primary consumers. They are the first, primary means first, they are the first to eat. So our first trophic level are the plants, the primary producers. Our second trophic level are the primary consumers, our herbivores. Then our third trophic level in purple here is our secondary consumers. Now this is going to be made of both omnivores and carnivores. They may eat the primary consumers as well as the primary producers. Or they might just eat primary consumers only and be a carnivore. And then we have in this picture a fourth trophic level called the tertiary consumers. They are the third level of consumers, and this is where you'll find your top predators, like your carnivores and things. So here, let's go ahead and just look at it again. So here we have our producers and our autotrophs make up our first trophic level called primary producers. Then our second trophic level is made of consumers, specifically heterotrophs and herbivores, like herbivores, whatever is eating the plants. So we have our primary consumers, our second trophic level. Now going into our third trophic level, we have our secondary consumers. These will be both omnivores and carnivores. And then we have our fourth trophic level in this diagram, which is our tertiary consumers, our third type of consumer, and these are going to be like your top predators. Now, sometimes you can have a fifth trophic level. It all depends on the ecosystem and if there's enough energy available. Not all ecosystems have a fifth trophic level. It's really only going to be places where you find lots of primary producers, like a rainforest, for example, has lots of stored energy in those plants. So therefore, it can support lots of levels versus like a desert where there's not many plants, there's not much energy to start with, and therefore it makes it more difficult to support lots of levels in that food web. To summarize, this is my last slide. Each of these organisms is dependent on the other. So here, let's say hunters, or for some reason, the top predator is removed. So this mountain lion population decreases. So now the deer, think about what's going to happen to if the mountain lion eats badgers and deer and snake, what's going to happen to their populations, right? Well, if you remove the top predator, well, now the deer population and the badger population are going to increase. You just removed one of their limiting factors. But as the deer and badger populations start to increase, because you remove their predators, they're going to overeat. They're going to, well, not each deer, but there's going to be so much competition for food, you're going to find the food levels are going to decrease. And then you're going to have a starvation of those populations. And then if the deer overgraze, then the mice will suffer, and so will the snakes. And then so will, but look at this one, hasn't been affected so far. Its predator has been removed. And then, but eventually it will overeat its grasshoppers. And basically the whole point of this is that our food webs are all so interconnected that each species is important in that ecosystem or in that food web and within the food chains. Now, some are more important than others, and we'll talk about that when we get to keystone species. So they're not all equal. Some are more equal or some are more important than others. All right, good job.